Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming to visit Walker Lectures on Zoom. My name is John Kelly. I am one of the trustees for the Walker Lecture Series, and it is my privilege to serve with Alwyn Fine and Paula Demers and Joanne Martin and our president, Dale Harrington. We're all plunged into this new world together, and we've been exploring virtual options. We've had two virtual performances already for this season, and both of them are available by going to our website at walkerlecture.org or by checking into Concord TV and their website. One of them was Rich Lederer talking about presidents, fascinating facts about the presidents, and the other one was Scott Kirby with music from Key West. Coming up in the near future, we are planning to have a travelogue by Ed Webster, and his is about Antarctica. Soon enough, it will feel like Antarctica here. Keep your eyes and ears open for that. And as always, we're encouraging you to check out our website, and glad that all of you are on our email newsletter. We are planning to record tonight for future broadcast on Concord Television, and most of the time, Michael Tougias will be the center of attention in the recording, but your face might appear occasionally, so I want you to have the option to turn the camera off if you want to protect your face from broadcast on Concord TV. And we are grateful for Concord TV for working with us to make these events happen. Near the end of the presentation, we'll ask you to put, if you have some questions, to put them in the chat. I will ask you to wait till near the end, because otherwise it might get lost in all of the other cool, interesting socializing that's happening on the chat. So at the end, put your questions in the chat, and I will mediate, and Michael Tougias will take some time to answer those questions. Michael Tougias is a New York Times best-selling author and co-author of 29 books. Among his bestsellers are The Finest Hours, Disney Motion Pictures version, opened in 45 countries in January of 2016. He also talked a little bit about some of his other books, Fatal Forecast, Overboard, King Phillips War, and There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse, The Vermont Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. In a moment, I will ask you before, if you still have your picture on, to give Michael a warm Walker Lecture jazz hands welcome. Welcome, Michael Tougias.
Thank you. I love that jazz hands. And thank you to all the volunteers in the Walker Lecture Series that put this all together. I know there's a lot of hard work that goes on behind the scenes. This is the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrim, so the topic is certainly appropriate for this time. And we were chatting, some of us, earlier before the start. How did I get my interest in King Philip's Indian War? And I was saying I grew up in Western Massachusetts, and Longmeadow, Mass, and my town was attacked. And it would have been the perfect topic to teach the kids in school, but they never said a word about it in our history classes. So I always thought King Philip was an English king, but Philip was the English given name to a Native American leader named Metacom. So when we get to the part of the presentation where we're into the war, you may hear me use those two names for the same person. Metacom and Philip were the same person. And ironically, Metacom was the son of Massasoit. So there's a lot of strange ironies with this period. So what I've done is I've tried to encapsulate, it's over a 50-year period that we're going to cover. By using the slides, I want you to feel like you're watching a documentary with the author giving some of the behind the scenes research that we did. And then at the end, I'll take questions. And sometimes if I get stumped, there's somebody in the audience that knows the answer. And, so many of my books are really serious kind of nail biters, the survival at sea and those. So I really enjoy every now and then. That's that Porcupine in the Outhouse book that John mentioned. So I'm going to share my screen now. And we will get started. If at any time you folks can't hear me well, just wave and I'll know something's up. And this was I wrote two books and co-wrote one of them and wrote the other, but this was the first, and this is a novel of King Philip's War, where the lead character is fictional, but all the events that happen to this character are true, and they're in the right chronological order. So this book led me to meet the co-author, Eric Schultz, and together we did King Philip's War. And Eric was the mastermind behind this book, and I came on the scene a little bit later, but Eric and I were talking recently, and I was saying the way I reached out to him was he had sent me an old-fashioned letter when Until I Have No Country came out, saying congratulations, and I'm at work on a history book of the war. And then years later, when I started my work on a history book of the war, I said, hey, didn't I get a letter from somebody saying they were doing something similar? And I found the letter, called Eric, and that's how we met. So that was in the days long before email. So we kind of start before the Europeans arrive. Here's where the various tribes were located in New England. And when we do talk about King Philip, he was a Wampanoag. So you see that kind of that southeast corner of Massachusetts. And by the way, the Massachusetts tribe, they got really hit hard by disease introduced by early explorers and fur traders. On my screen, I see someone wants to come in. So since I'm the host, I can let them in. So you may see me from time to time pause and let somebody in. The Massachusetts tribe, they had no immunities to things like measles and smallpox. So scores died long before the Pilgrims ever even arrived. And these tribes in New England, they were not nomadic. They had their summering grounds and their wintering grounds. They called this the Wetu. We changed that to wigwam. But you see the grinding stone in front. They grew same crops we would grow: corn, squash, beans, pumpkins. I found one of those grinding stones in the woods once. And one of the other artifacts I found with the help of Stanley, everybody needs a mentor. And when I was working on the book, Stanley Buzarevich, an amateur archaeologist, taught me how to find artifacts, and he was just a great mentor. He's passed away, but this was an axe head that we found in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And the natives would use those big axe heads to cut down the old growth white pines. You know, we don't really have any old growth trees to speak of in New England, except for a few small patches. But back then, when Champlain first came to America, he said it had a park-like appearance, meaning the trees were so big there was very little undergrowth. So he said you could march an army right through. Again, the trees were crowding out the undergrowth. But these white pines, they make a great dugout canoe. So that's what the natives were doing. In northern New England, by the way, they used the birch bark canoes. In southern New England was the dugout canoes. So this is my mentor, Stanley Buzarevich, and he's demonstrating the Atlatl, or the throwing stick. And this was really one of the first inventions by the Paleo Indians. And we're going back to just after the Ice Age, and the glaciers are retreating, so approximately 11,000 years ago. And the way this implement works is the spear rests on top of the throwing stick, And when he brings his arm forward, he doesn't let go of the stick, but the spear goes flying off. And it's really amazing. He made me a bunch of these, and I can go to a football field, stand at one goalpost, and almost hit the other. And this is another friend, Wes. He's an Abenaki Indian I met a while back, and I put the slide in to remind us that when we do get into King Philip's Indian War, the natives did have muskets. So they'd been trading beaver pelts, things like that, for some of the European goods, particularly muskets. So it wasn't as if they were fighting with just bow and arrows. They were using muskets as well. And natives wouldn't think of killing an animal without using every part of its body. Stanley taught me how to use the antlers from a deer to flake a piece of quartz into a projectile point. You just have to do it very carefully, because one hit a little too hard and the whole thing cracks in half. And one of the books I used in my research was written in 1630 by William Wood, so not too long after the Pilgrims arrived. And in it, he said, there's this great beast in the New World. He said, it's called the moose, and we plan to ride it, and it will plow all our fields. They never did domesticate the moose, but you could see why he would say that, because it sure looks like a horse with antlers. I took this picture up in northern New Hampshire, way up in Pittsburgh. And, the moose population is really in a decline because of the winter tick problem. The ticks just cover the moose and literally suck the blood from the moose until it can't survive. So what we need is a really, really cold winter to kill off these winter ticks. One of the things the natives would do is raid a muskrat lodge to get inside, not for the muskrat, but to get the roots and the tubers so that the natives, could eat them. Then they'd patch the top so the muskrat could survive the winter and they could do it again. So we call that conservation. So, when the Pilgrims came over, and by the way, no matter what you think about their practices or their viewpoints, they certainly were a brave group to put, I think it was 102 of them on a ship approximately 100 feet long and cross the whole Atlantic Ocean to a new world that had not been settled. And they were originally heading towards what was called the Virginia territories. And what made them change their mind was, well, we've still got people entering, so I'm going to keep letting them in as they come in. One thing that made them come towards Massachusetts was a storm that threw them off course. And by then, supplies were running low. So they decided, let's head to the nearest landfall. And many people think, well, that was Plymouth, Massachusetts, but it was actually the tip of Cape Cod that they went to first. And on the way, they organized the Mayflower Compact, because on the Mayflower, it wasn't just the Pilgrims. They called themselves saints, but there were also the strangers, which were the people not associated with their religion. And they could see some tension brewing, so they got everybody to buy into this agreement. So, even though if you read the Mayflower Compact, it's very vague. Some people say it's the first seeds of democracy. And they would have to take the shallop, the small launch, from the bigger ship towards shore. And they actually landed at Provincetown. So that was their first landing. It was not at Plymouth. And one of the reasons they didn't settle on the Cape was near the spot where I have marked Corn Hill. They found some Indian corn buried in a woven tub. It was at an abandoned village. It could have been at a grave site. We'll never know for sure, but they took that corn. They knew what it was, the seed. to plant themselves. And Bradford, the head of the Pilgrims, wrote in his journal, "We plan to compensate the natives for the corn we took," but the natives didn't know that, so they thought these Europeans had stolen their corn, so they attacked the Pilgrims on First Encounter Beach. And no one was killed in that skirmish, but that was one of the reasons that the Pilgrims went back on the Mayflower and decided we can't settle on Cape Cod, hostile natives there. And so they went to Plymouth, which the Patuxet natives used to live at, but they've been wiped out by disease. So the Pilgrims saw some of the fields, they were growing up with brush and whatnot. Yeah. But earlier, those fields had been cultivated by the Patuxets. And the Plymouth leaders took that as a sign from God that that's where they should settle. This is great. We're still letting people in. We've got a lot of people. We're probably up to 100. So if you go to Provincetown, that's why there's a Pilgrim monument there. For years, I wondered, why is there a Pilgrim monument at Provincetown? And it's because that's where the Pilgrims first landed. A big problem, though, for these newcomers was they're getting a late start. They were at Provincetown in the winter and in November, and then over at Plymouth in December. And as they get off that ship and get on the little shallop, the water's freezing cold, so they're getting wet. And approximately half the Pilgrims died that first winter from disease brought on by exposure, lack of proper food. Most of it was pneumonia. They would get wet leaving the shallop, wading to shore, like you see in this picture. And I like this picture because it does show snow on the grounds, and all my research indicates that the temperatures were so much colder back then here in New England, and the snowfalls were just so deep. So that was the big issue, and the Pilgrims were losing people left and right to pneumonia, and they decided, we're going to bury our dead at night. And you go, why would they do that? Well, they knew they were under observation by the natives in the area. They'd seen them from afar. So far, in those months of December, January, they didn't have any contact yet, but they knew they were being watched, and they didn't want the natives to see just how many of their number they were burying. So if you go to Plymouth today and walk the grounds, you'll see where the burying grounds were, and you'll see an explanation of what they were doing. And then suddenly this native walks right into the settlement there at Plymouth, and he shocks the Pilgrims because he goes, "Welcome, Englishmen." And they're like, how does this guy know English? And it was Samoset who had learned English from early explorers and fur traders. And the reason he walked in is he had Massasoit's blessing to come in. And I'll explain a little bit more why Massasoit decided to help the Pilgrims rather than, he could have wiped them out in a matter of just one day. And then a little later, another native walks in, and this was Squanto, and he speaks even better English because he had been taken prisoner by an early explorer, taken all the way back to Europe, somehow found his way back to the New World, was now under the domain of Massasoit, and Massasoit allowed him to go in with the Pilgrims and teach them, which crops to plant, how to catch the fish, what creatures to hunt. So largely the reason that the Pilgrims survived is because of those two Native Americans that walked into their settlement and helped them. And that was because of the blessing of Massasoit. Now, the name Massasoit, we always think, oh, that was his name. that wasn't his name. Massasoit just means great leader. His actual name is Osamequin, which is yellow feather. So yellow feather, or as we know him, Massasoit, decides, I want to align myself with these pilgrims because they have the thunder sticks, they have the muskets, and that will give us equal footing against a much more powerful tribe to our south, which were the Narragansetts. So that was one of his reasons for helping them when he could have, in fact, driven them out because they're settling on Wampanoag land. So Eric Schultz and I thought it was so important that young people know that, hey, it was actually two Indians that helped the Pilgrims survive, that we wrote a couple different issues for the kids magazine, Cobblestones. This is one we did. And I was saying to Allwine earlier, lately my project has been writing books for children from age 8 to 12. It's been really gratifying to bring in what a reviewer called, these are great books for reluctant readers. And they're called the True Rescue series. So, but the beginning of that career was writing for Cobblestones, which puts out a good quality magazine. Today, natives don't think of Thanksgiving the way we do, that, oh, it's this great holiday, the natives and the Pilgrims all getting together to break bread. They look at it as the beginning of the end, that, Massasoit allowed them to get established, and before you know it, they're expanding and taking more and more land. So this sign has gone up in Plymouth because prior to that, a lot of the natives were demonstrating every Thanksgiving to try and get their viewpoint across. And I thought this was the perfect compromise, tell both sides of that particular history. So you had a period of relative peace with Massasoit aligning himself with the Pilgrims. But more and more settlers are coming into the New World, and they're settling in Boston, which would be the Puritans. They're settling Rhode Island, which would be Roger Williams' followers, and in Connecticut as well. And it's in Connecticut that the first, they call it the Pequod War. I'm not sure war is the right term because it didn't last very long. But the Pequods were a powerful tribe. They felt they had been cheated by an English trader, and that trader was killed. And so skirmishes began to happen between the colonists in Connecticut and the Pequods, who were the dominant tribe in Connecticut. So finally, the colonists decided, we're going to take the offensive rather than having our towns attacked, and we're going to do a surprise attack on the main Pequod village, which is down in Ledyard, Connecticut. And here's this was an old etching from the period showing the attack on the village. Now, most of the native villages did have a palisaded wall around the outside, and the purpose for that was mostly in the winter to keep the wolves from coming in, but also if they had enemy tribes in the area. And so John Mason decided he knew where this was and he was going to attack. And so you see the ring of colonial militia firing their muskets, a little bit of fire coming out of the end. And then you wonder, well, what is those natives with the bow and arrows doing outside of them? Well, those were Narragansetts who the Connecticut English aligned themselves with to put down the Pequods. And the English were very effective at, I guess you would call it, exploiting these age-old animosities between tribes and taking one tribe on their side to snuff out another one. And, when I think of all the Indian wars in America, the problem was the natives were never totally united. Maybe not until the Little Bighorn when you had Sioux, Arapaho, Cheyenne, all joining together. And you saw what they did to the Custer and the 7th Cavalry, but it was too late by then. Had they all aligned early on, the whole settling of America would have been very different. And it was interesting to read some of the eyewitness accounts of the attack on the Pequod village, because the Narragansetts, who were with the English attacking the Pequods, had never seen total warfare. In other words, had never seen an annihilation of the enemy, men, women, and children. And they were shouting, enough, enough. With natives, if they were fighting another tribe, you'd want to dominate the other tribe, not annihilate them. But the English basically annihilated the Pequods, and there's a very interesting video about this down at Foxwoods Casino in Ledyard, Connecticut. They have a great museum there. And so the green path here shows the movement of the Connecticut English, how they came down and attacked the Pequods. They went along the coast first to get up to Narragansett to get the Narragansett Indians to fight with them. And then they looped back and attacked the Pequods on the Mystic River. And after that, Mass Bay Colony jumped in and wanted to get involved. And did kind of the mop-up operations. And so if you were to extend this trail of destruction, it would go all the way to New Haven, where Mass Bay Colony colonial militia, and when I say militia, they're just farmers taking up arms against the natives. They trailed the remaining Pequods and it killed as many as they could in New Haven. So after the Pequods were put down, that sent the message to the remaining tribes, look what would happen to you if you take up arms against us, the English. And so even more English flooded in and started expanding. They would dig ditches like this to drain the lowlands so they could let their cattle go in and feed on the rich marsh grass. And then they started building mill sites everywhere. This is a real beauty. If you ever want to take a Sunday drive, there's some beautiful sites in Rhode Island. I'll mention a few as I go through the slides, but this is one, the Gilbert Stuart Mill down in Wickford, Rhode Island. And these little mill sites were scattered on every little stream throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. New Hampshire, only coastal New Hampshire had been settled at this early time. And the town commons, they always had a fence around them because they really were common land. Anybody could use them at night to bring in their sheep and their cattle, because we had wolves, we had mountain lion here in New England. I've never seen a mountain lion myself, but I'm one of the believers that they are back at the cabin this summer. Boy, I think over the last, I've had the cabin since I was 22 years old, and I think I've heard every animal there was, but boy, this summer I heard a yowl that I think was a mountain lion, and a neighbor up there claims he saw one. So I'm a believer that there might be one or two back in New England. The natives had, besides land that the colonists wanted, they had the beaver pelts. And so there was an active trade between Native Americans and the English. So the natives wanted the steel implements or the muskets, and they would trade the beaver pelts. They would bring them to various trading posts. This is one that's been recreated along the Cape Cod Canal. Of course, back then there was no canal, but two rivers came close. And out in front are the stocks. And one of the people that were often put in the stocks were the Quakers. And it was the Puritans were the ones who had the most intolerant society. If you had a different religious viewpoint, if you spoke up too loudly about it, you were put in the stocks. And then your next penalty, oftentimes they would take this hot iron spike and bore a hole right through your tongue so that you could never blaspheme again. And that's why so many Quakers left what is now modern-day Massachusetts and went down to Rhode Island. So you don't see Quaker meeting houses like this one outside of Boston, but you see them down towards Rhode Island, because Roger Williams had a much more open society. And Roger Williams had a good relationship with the Narragansetts, a good working relationship. It was really a model that the other colonists could have followed, but did not. And this shot, some of you may recognize, it's on the Charles River in South Natick, right below the dam. And this was the site of the Reverend John Eliot's experiment. He was trying to convert natives to Christianity and live more like the white man. And the experiment was actually going good. There were native settlements all along the river here in South Natick and Dover and Sherborne. But when King Philip's War broke out in 1675, all natives were viewed with suspicion. So these natives tried to be neutral, but they were taken from their homes and put out on Deer Island in Boston Harbor so that they couldn't get involved in the war. And the problem was the folks that put them out there didn't give them enough food and shelter, and scores of these Christian Indians died on Deer Island. So we've kind of jumped ahead. You see the settling of the land and the expanding of the English colonists. And if you're a Native American, you kind of only have two choices. One is the status quo, and the status quo is not good. You see the rise of English power and the fall of Native power, because by 1675, there's more English people in New England than there are natives. And the English laws are superseding any tribal customs. And so Metacom, you see in this engraved bust in bronze, is the one that finally decides we have to take up arms to try and get some of our land back. And there were a few sparks that I'll talk about that kind of triggered this decision by him. By the way, his headquarters, again, if you want to make this nice day trip down to Rhode Island to see these different sites, his headquarters was at the Mount Hope Peninsula in Bristol, Rhode Island. So we call it Mount Hope, but the natives called it Montauk, and in the Wampanoag language, that means the high place. And so that was both the headquarters of Massasoit and for Philip, or Metacom. And if you take a walk down there, you can go visit King Philip's chair. I'm sitting in the chair. Legend has it he would address his tribe there. And natives go there today and gather for various ceremonies. People think I'm part Native American, but I don't have a drop. And if I could choose, I'd be a Pequod because they own Foxwoods. But it was fun. I asked, can I take photos of your ceremony? And it really was eye-opening. And one of their main goals was to get the children involved so that they don't lose the culture over time. I mentioned I'd talk about a couple flashpoints of King Philip's War. This was one before the war that, led Metacom to start this uprising. It was the death of John Sassamon, who was a Native American, but he was working for the English as an interpreter. And his body was found in the spring when the ice melted at Assawampset Pond down in Middleborough. And the English assumed that it was Metacom or Metacom's followers that had him killed. They thought maybe he might have been a spy for the English. We'll never know the full version of this. When you think about it, the victors write the history, and in the Native American world, they didn't have the written language to pass down. So when I was researching both books, we did interview Native American historians who had an oral tradition of the history passed down. But anyways, the English rounded up 3 of Metacom's followers, found them guilty of killing John Sassamon, and hung all 3. And that was probably one of the straws that broke the camel's back of Metacom, that the English could come right in and arrest 3 of his people and hang them. So again, if you're a Native American, those 2 choices, they're pretty grim. Status quo doesn't look good for the future, and taking up arms doesn't look great either because of what happened to the Pequods, but that's what happened. And Metacom knew that once the war started, and by the way, it started in Swansea, Massachusetts, when some natives attacked a farm. He did not want to be trapped on Mount Hope, because if you look on a map, it's a peninsula, and all the English had to do was come down from the north and they'd have him trapped. So he left Mount Hope, went across Mount Hope Bay over to modern day Tiverton, Rhode Island, Little Compton, Rhode Island, and hid in the swamps there. And in this photo, this is the first battle of King Philip's War. It's called the Peas Field, which is down in Tiverton. And it was Benjamin Church who was leading some of the settlers who had taken up arms against the natives, walking through this field when the natives, who were hiding way back behind that tree line, set the ambush. Church was very lucky to survive. He hid down by the rocks by the water and was rescued by a passing ship. But Church learned a valuable lesson, and he wrote about it. Church wrote a book about the whole war. We put part of his book at the back of our King Philip's War book because it is it's in the public domain. And Church said, what I really learned was take friendly Indians with me in the future so I don't walk into ambushes, because they can spot the ambushes. And he told the English powers that be to do the same, but they did not. So if you go down to view that battle site or view Mount Hope, you can also see where Church is buried, right behind the church, adjacent to the town common. So they're beautiful back roads. It's Eric Schultz and I, one thing we insisted on with the King Philip's War book was some publishers wanted to publish it, but they wouldn't put the maps in. And Eric and I had both been speaking on King Philip's War, and people always wanted the maps because they wanted to visit some of the battle sites. So I'm so glad we held out for a small press called Countryman Press that kind of got absorbed by Norton now. So it's not even in existence, but they were up in Vermont and they agreed to put all 45 maps in the book, because we had both learned that's what the reader wants, follow the action. Metacom leaves the swamp and at night is attacking nearby English settlements. This is the foundation of one of the garrison houses in Dartmouth. So if you hear the term garrison house, it just means that's the safe house to run to if your town is being attacked. And in it will be extra water, muskets, food. Get to the garrison house if a cannon is fired or an attack is happening. So the red arrows show the movements of Metacom in the first couple of months. I mentioned how he left Mount Hope, then went into the Pecasset swamp, but he had to leave there. He couldn't stay in the swamp forever. So he starts heading towards central Massachusetts. And the reason he does that is he knows that the Nipmuc Indians, a whole different tribe, on their own, with no coordination, have risen up to attack the town of Minden, Mass., which is where I live today. And every structure in Minden was burned to the ground. So Metacom knows that he's got this ally, another tribe. So he might have come up the Blackstone River. That would have been, a likely highway, if you will, follow the river. And this is one of the many beautiful King Philip overlooks scattered throughout southern New England. So when he arrives in central Mass on the banks of the Ware River, This was the big Nipmuc settlement. It was called the Winnamesset Village. And there were hundreds of wigwams here. And the Nipmucs are celebrating because they've not only attacked Mendon, they've attacked the town of Brookfield. And the way they did the Brookfield attack was the soldiers who were at the garrison, and again, when I say soldiers, I'm not talking about English soldiers, I'm talking about colonial militia. They were told, go out and meet with the local natives and take your muskets and armor and go on horseback, which was unusual, and show them, the force and make them sign a peace treaty. But when they get to the expected meeting location, there were no natives there. They should have suspected trouble, but they did not. And Captain Wheeler made the mistake of saying, okay, let's go right into their village. And the natives were lying in ambush long before they could reach the wigwams. Again, the reason we know so much about this attack is we have the eyewitness source from Captain Wheeler. He did survive. He wrote down exactly what happened. And one of the contributions I made to the King Phillips War history book with Eric Schultz was put in these diaries at the back of the book so people can read exactly what happened from the people that lived through this terrible war. Then the natives tried to burn the garrison down at Brookfield where Wheeler was taken. And the only thing that saved them was luck. It started to rain and put the fires out. So now you have Wampanoags and you have Nipmucs together joining forces, and most of them leave the Brookfield area and set up a big base camp at Turner's Falls. The natives called it the Great Falls. And then from there, they start attacking towns like Northfield, right on the New Hampshire border, Deerfield, Mass, going right down, the Pioneer Valley, culminating in the attack on Springfield. The Mohawks do not join because they've always been enemies of all the tribes in New England. So they stay out of it. And this is when Bloody Brook occurs, and it's yet another ambush that the English allow themselves to get lured into. They had gone up to Deerfield after it was attacked to get the remaining survivors to safety down towards Northampton. And the militiamen let their guard down on the way back, figuring, well, if there was going to be an ambush, it would happen on the way to Deerfield. Well, the ambush was set up to hit them as the wagons are loaded with survivors in grain at Muddy Brook, which was later called Bloody Brook. And in this etching, this wood carving, you see the natives hiding on either side of the hillside above the path. And that's a typical ambush point. Anytime you're going through kind of a pinch point, that's where the ambushes would be set up. And these militiamen were very slow to learn this. 76 English people were killed in that one ambush, and that's a big amount considering the small population in 1675. And they're buried here right on the town common of South Deerfield. So again, I always encourage people to go to some of these sites. If you go to South Deerfield and you go to Bloody Brook, you can drive right to the top of Mount Sugarloaf and get these great views. So when I was writing the novel about the war, Until I Have No Country, I'd go to those places to try to get the feel of it before I wrote the chapter that took place there. And the view from Sugarloaf it really hasn't changed that much in all these years. The isolated farm down in the floodplain. This was called the breadbasket for New England, the floodplain along the Connecticut River, because the topsoil from years of flooding is so deep. And so these two tribes are controlling most of Massachusetts, and you would think the settlers have everything they can do to fight just these two. But instead, they do something odd. They unite and they decide to attack the neutral Narragansetts. And you'd be like, why would they do that? Well, the thinking from the colonies was the Narragansetts are going to eventually join up with Metacom. And the Narragansetts are really powerful. And if that happens, it's going to be curtains for us. So if we hit the Narragansetts in a sneak attack while they're still neutral and have not joined with Metacom, we can wipe them out before that happens. And that's exactly what they did. They found where the big fortified winter encampment was, and they went down and attacked. There was a Native American historian, Ella Seketow, who I interviewed many years ago. She was the lead historian for the Narragansett Nation. And I remember saying to her, tell me about the Great Swamp Fight. And she pauses and looks me in the eye and she goes, you mean Great Swamp Massacre. In other words, don't call it a fight because they killed men, women, and children and we were neutral. But from the colonial standpoint, it was a fight because they lost a number of soldiers trying to fight their way inside that fortified winter encampment of the Narragansetts. But they eventually did find their way in, and they torched the camp above Benjamin Church's protest. He said we should, after we kill the natives, we should move into this encampment and fight the remaining Narragansetts from here. This will be our base. But he was overruled, and they torched the whole thing. So way down in Charleston, Rhode Island, there is this big monolith to the Narragansett Nation, and then the stones around it represent the attacking colonies. And then Church writes in his book how many of the soldiers were wounded, and it was a blizzard during the Great Swamp Fight. So now they've got to march all the way from the Great Swamp Native encampment back to Wickford, the Wickford garrison on the coast. And he said many of the wounded soldiers died on the way, and they were carried here, and they're buried in a mass grave behind this garrison house. This is open to the public. It's called Smith's Castle. You can walk around the grounds, and sometimes it's open for the inside. So we're into February 1676. My fiance Allison jokes, who drew this map, King Philip? But these are my low-tech maps that I use in my research. But the war returns to the east because they attack the town of Lancaster. You're starting to get closer to Boston. And this is where they take Mary Rowlandson captive. And she was an amazing woman. I made her a character in Until I Have No Country, and I used part of her diary in the history book because she survived 11 weeks of captivity, and she even had a conversation with Metacom. So she's the only English person that talked to him during the war, and this is her trail. This is her garrison house where they took her captive. I often thought, from a native perspective, trying to overrun these garrison houses was not a good idea because, they were well fortified and the natives would be picked off as they're charging. In a war of attrition, you don't want to lose warriors like that. They were so much more effective just doing hit and run. But in this period of the attack on Lancaster, they were successful in overtaking the garrison, and that's when they took Mary, her young infant, and two of her other children captive. But you'll read in the books how she survived through just sheer grit, ingenuity, making herself useful to the natives to gain more food. And she was released here at Redemption Rock in Princeton, Massachusetts. She does, in her account, she does say something that's really telling. about where the future of this war is going. She said, I was starving, but she said, so were the natives. So in other words, the natives had been so busy fighting since June of 1675. Now you're into, March of 1676. They haven't been able to grow any crops. So their food supplies are running low, and she documents that very clearly. And again, the attacks are getting closer to Boston, a dramatic attack on Medfield. A farmer goes to his barn the morning of the attack, and he sees the outline of a Native American leg under the hay, and he sees the moccasin. He knows there's a native hiding in his barn, so he picks up the pitchfork. He's going to kill the native. And then he thinks, wait a minute, what if there's more than one? So he puts the pitchfork down, leaves the barn. This was his little house. This is called the Peak House that was burned during the attack, but then rebuilt a couple years later. But he's able to wake his family up, and they all make it to the garrison house. But this Peak House is located on Route 109 in Medfield, and it gives you an idea of what English homes looked like back then. And you notice the windows are really small because glass was a real luxury. And the natives succeeded in burning a good portion of Medfield down, taking 18 prisoners with them. And now we're into April, so the war has almost hit the year point. And you would think by this point, the English militiamen would not be walking into ambushes, but they do yet again, and it's an absolute disaster during the Sudbury fight. They go right between those two hills in this sketch in the middle of this map. And again, that's where the natives were lying in ambush. And so that spring, I call it the terrible climax. All these towns are hit. Many are burned to the ground. Providence is burned to the ground. A garrison in Plymouth is overrun, and that was the Clark garrison, and people are killed there. So it's beginning to look like the natives are going to win and, basically force the English into a defensive ring around Boston. But spring is also the time when everything changes, the turning point. The English have finally listened to Benjamin Church, and they're fighting alongside friendly natives. So you see the Connecticut English with the Mohegans. They catch Canonchet, the head of the Narragansetts, and he's killed. So the leadership of the uprising is being chipped away at. Metacom's still alive, but some of the other leaders like Muddawump and Canonchet have been killed. And then really the battle that breaks the backs of the natives is the attack on Turner's Falls. Captain Turner leads this attack coming up from Northampton and Hadley. He's got volunteers, and he's going to take the fight to the natives instead of the other way around. And it was a big village up there. So if you're a native, this would have been a place where you could rest and resupply before the next mission, and Turner's going to spring the surprise. And this is happening during May, so the river is swollen. During the attack, some natives tried to swim across the river, but they were swept right over the falls. And the way Turner really surprised that village was, instead of attacking from the south, like a native would assume, because that's where the settlements were. There were no settlements to the north at this time. He curls around, tethers his horses, and then swoops down on the village. So he's kind of got the natives trapped up against the river. And he burns this village to the ground. But interestingly, he does not survive the day. During his retreat back to safety, some of the natives who survive catch up and kill him. And this is a scene in Until I Have No Country, because I had so many dreams about it and nightmares because I was spending months and months just researching this one attack. But this really did break the backs of the natives because they no longer have a safe haven in southern New England. So if you're a hostile native, you're probably going to go north and join up with the Abenakis. There's no safe place. All your villages have been burned in southern New England. But Metacom, who we think was at Mount Wachusett at the time, we're not 100% sure, but most research seems to indicate that. He goes back to Montauk, the high place, Bristol, Rhode Island, which is where he was born and his tribal lands, probably knowing the war is lost. And sure enough, that's where he's killed by a native trader, a Wampanoag, who's joined up with Benjamin Church. And that native puts 2 musket balls through the back of Metacom, and he's killed right there at Mount Hope. And I'm getting to my last couple of slides, but before I do so, if you want to order a personalized book as a gift for the holidays, here's the website, and all the books are discounted there. And So Close to Home, the book about the U-boat coming to America and the American family survival story, we've got that at half price on there as well. So check it out. And there's some videos there of the various rescues that I write about in the books like So Close to Home and A Storm Too Soon. But I wanted to come back to King Philip's War. There's only one leader left, and he is killed as well after Metacom. And so any remaining natives have to leave Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, except for a few that totally stayed out of the war and were given very small patches of land to live on, tiny reservations, nothing like their old land. But that's why today, if you go to Martha's Vineyard, for example, Wampanoags own what we used to call Gay Head. They call it Quina now, because they stayed out of the war. But the others went up to New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and then later joined forces with the French to get revenge on these English settlements to the south. But we're getting into a whole nother period. But, the good news is, I mentioned in the beginning, so I grew up in Longmeadow, Mass, and they never taught us about the war. Today, they do teach the war, so they don't sweep it under the rug because it's uncomfortable to talk about really the extermination of a people. It is taught in the school systems, and I think that's the right way to do it. Show both sides. It was a terrible war for both sides. In fact, on a per capita basis, there was more casualties during King Philip's War than any war America fought in, including the Civil War. So that's why it's such an important war and needs to be taught. And it was right here in our own backyards. And so now, John, we can entertain questions in the chat boxes or however you want to do it. If I stop sharing my screen, I think we'll come back. Okay.
So I had one question. My understanding is King Philip's body was cut into 4 pieces and hung in separate trees. I mean, that's a really racist act. I really think that is a very significant part of what happened later with the indigenous peoples.
Yes, his in his skull was put on a pike, a post in Plymouth, and it stayed there for 20 years to serve as a warning to any visiting natives. This is what will happen to you if you resist, if you take up arms against us. So all sorts of legends about his hand was cut off and given to the native that killed him. I went into a school, King Philip's High School, many years ago, and the principal said to me, one day when we were having this kind of history exhibit. A Native American girl brought in a jar, and in it was a hand, and she claimed it was King Philip's hand. And when I spoke to some of the tribal leaders that I knew, they said, well, we were given that hand. We do think it was Metacom's hand, and we buried it in a secret location. But nobody knows for sure because there's no DNA or anything. So there's so many of these legends out there, and we'll never know for sure.
We have a question from Matthew in the chat. How did the Native Americans draw the lines for their territories? How did they describe the boundaries orally so that everybody understood?
Probably, rivers, by and large, would be the easiest boundary lines. It's interesting, there's a place in, I think it's Plainville, Mass., where the three colonies intersected as well, and it's called the Angle Tree Stone. And the colonies put this granite marker there. It's still there today, where the three colonies intersected. And that isn't on a river, but for the natives, the rivers would serve as one of the primary places for boundaries. In some places, you had like an area of, I call it like a no man's land. The Berkshires were very sparsely populated because you had the Mohawks in New York, who were a really powerful tribe, the Algonquin tribe settling along, say, the Pioneer Valley. If you're in that no man's land, you'd be the first one to maybe suffer from a Mohawk raid. So it was very sparsely settled.
And another question from my friend Alice. Did the English take captives, or did they kill everyone in the villages they attacked?
No, they did take captives, primarily women and children, but sometimes males as well. And what they would do is they would bring them to the center of, say, Boston, and at Boston Common, they would sell them into slavery. But the bidders weren't New Englanders. They were slave traders, basically. And so most of the Native Americans who were sold into slavery ended up in either Bermuda or the Caribbean to work the sugarcane fields. So many Native Americans who I spoke with said we've traced some of our ancestors back to people living in Bermuda, which really surprised me. Any other questions or comments? I can't see the chat boxes, so I think John can see them.
I can. There's no other question yet on chat. I see Art Swede with his, I think it's Art Swede, Art with his hand up.
It's me.
Hi.
I was just wondering, why did they call him King Philip?
You know what? That's a great question. Thank you. I normally I say that in the beginning, and I forgot that his father was Massasoit, and when relationships were good, the English bestowed two honorary names on Massasoit's two sons. One got the name Philip, and the other got the name Alexander. And then later during the war, the English didn't use the native term for leader, which would have been, sachem or Massasoit. They used king for leader, so they call him King Philip. And that one name has caused more confusion because it throws people off. They hear King Philip's War and they're not interested. They think it's some Englishmen came over to the colonies. And it threw me off as well as a kid. So I was lucky my dad knew enough to whet my appetite. Any other follow-up questions or comments? Boy, we had great participants. We were well over 90 for a while there. That's really nice. And then just to know that we're all stuck at home, but we can go in.
Alice might have the final question of the evening.
Oops. I just wonder what the numbers of people who were killed, both Native Americans and the English?
So these would be very rough estimates, but approximately 800 English people and approximately 2,900 Native Americans during King Philip's War. And then I believe in the front of the King Philip's War history book, we then put in the per capita casualty rate for World War II, the Civil War, King Philip's War, and you see King Philip's War just blows away the others in terms of the small population at the time. So it really set the colonies back, even though the English colonists won. So many of their towns were destroyed. It took years to come back. But those colonists learned a lot about guerrilla fighting, and when the revolution came, they remembered some of those tactics that the Indians used and used it against the British.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's hear it for our visitor tonight.
I love that.
And we're so grateful that our Walker audience has embraced this new format. I hope to see you again, and I will keep you informed about upcoming events. Thank you for coming tonight.